Hello everyone, today we talk about the evangelization of Saxony, of the Heliand, the epic poem in Old Saxon, written sometime in the first half of the 9th century, either under Louis the Pious or Louis the German. That is not only the longest manuscript that has been handed over to us in Old Saxon, meaning the Savior, Heliand, as a matter of fact, is essentially an epic poem that paraphrases the Bible, as we will see now, but also of the relevance that this work had for the Carolingian, essentially, consolidation in the country. The passage, let's say, from what we would call, and this is a bit the theme of the video, a pagan to a Christian kind of sensitivity of some sort in the country, that the Franks accomplished what not even the Romans had managed to do, that is to say, to properly fully conquer and properly colonize for good Germany, that would become, in fact, with the Ottonians, the center of the empire itself, right? So there is an incredible success, not just of the political goal, of course, broadly meant, but also of the process of affirmation of Christianity in the land. I know that some of you are particularly interested in these topics, and there is an evangelization of Europe playlist where I collected all the videos, and they are a significant amount by now, in the tens, about the topic. Right, because we discussed kind of religion, broadly speaking, and this idea that I've already, explained countless times, that whenever we think about, in fact, a difference between paganism, what we call paganism, and Christianity, in a universal and traditional sense, in fact, it doesn't have properly any meaning whatsoever, right? And not because any of the two kind of copied the others, because they were all fully within that same universal religion that was the only one that, before the Enlightenment, naturally everybody simply understood as such without any categorization. And around the Heliand, that, as we'll see now, was an effort to, in fact, propose the Eastern Frankish subjects, and especially the ones that were yet to fully Christianize, with properly the new world, right? And so a set of values that at least was more along the temper of what the Carolingian Empire and in fact the revival of the Roman Empire and the Christian Roman Empire at this point had had been carried out at this point, was functional to, as we have seen successfully, to integrate further these population in the hierarchical system. And before someone says, integrated or we're subjugated, blah, 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 first of all, they lost, right? So if there was truly any warlike traditional meaning in the accomplishment of a people, they failed in the first place. And secondly, as everybody knows about 9th century German history, especially from the Stellinger revolt, right? There was, of course, a successful cooptation of the local elites that would be the ones that would keep, in fact, ruling over Germany, the Eastern Frankish kingdom, even after the disgregation of what we call as such the Carolingian Empire. While, of course, there was a social strain that brought definitely, and the Stellinger embodied this, just the freemen and the serfs / slaves to join arms to try to counter this movement from the top, but it was definitely successful, and especially in a country like probably the Eastern Frankish lands, this this achievement must, as for any other context, by the way, be understood in the fundamental acceptation, right? The fact that if there was anything burning under the ashes, it definitely didn't manifest. As far as the decisive moral support of the population, it did not manifest itself, because without that, nobody could have carried this out. It took 33 years for the Carolingians to subjugate Saxony, and we know how that happened, right? Massacres, deportations, but most of it, right? Saxony was not emptied of its population. Those remained largely all there, right? So if things went on, right, in some generation, the Saxons becoming the Christian Roman emperors, well, I think that you can see there mostly a civilizational accomplishment, and definitely not some kind of masked paganistic coming back that never occurred, as of course the land was Christianized for good, also achieving this other feat later on, right? So what is fascinating about this topic is, first of all, the setting. In many ways, I made a video about the Carolingian conquest of Saxony. I will have to discuss properly the Eastern Frankish Kingdom in detail. I'm preparing something probably about the Eastern frontier, at least throughout the Carolingian times, Henry the Fowler and Otto I. So there's really a lot there, and there is a medieval Germany, but also an Eastern Frankish Kingdom proper playlist that I created, which can help framing better the context. We need to get a bit more in the specifics of 9th century German history proper. The Heliand is a key to understanding of this, at least in as much as it embodied this first phase of properly the post-conquest one, right? So the one in which the Carolingians began to rule after the bloodshed, whatever, that even the so-called massacre of Verden, where Woden was buried at, is also, in terms of the sheer bloodbath, mostly a Carolingian propagandistic invention. I mean, the Carolingians were rightfully proud to say we basically exterminated all these, not just heathens per se, but of course a people that had been harassing for centuries uninterruptedly some of the most important areas of the Frankish heartland, mostly Austrasia, the Rhineland, and that finally got, say, were brought at their place, also with, an extra, civilizational point, again, as I was saying before. And that thus was fundamentally based by that, after this period, on, as a government, on kind of the force of persuasion. Again, the deterrence was there. Further revolts weren't about, not even selling a one, were about the continuity with the Carolingian system, right? They were already within that system. There was no way back, right, to the before. Also because, again, it would have been highly it was like coming backwards without any advantage for anyone involved at the time. And most of this video will be, however, not just about the Heliand as a piece of literature in itself, because it has an interesting history. It's a text that was also recovered during the Renaissance. Luther was interested, but mostly because of the manner of the German, in this case, the Old Saxon vernacular, right? That not only is, of course, is the language of the work, but it is also in a way that was trying to imitate, as we'll see now, the alliterative form, for example, of properly the Germanic epos, right? We can see it from the rest of this genre, how, linguistically speaking, that this is the case, because at some point it was believed even to have been a sort of forgery, but it wasn't, and also the process in which it was written down is fascinating, because likely the author wasn't, at least there is a debate about this, there may have been different sources at the same time, including literate ones that eventually, of course, had somebody writing them down, but there is also a significant literary sophistication, because you can see how the author, which is anyway a Christian, without any kind of secondary diversions, is is making this conscious cultural effort of adapting, at least this is the point of the video, not much the universal meaning as such. That is, historiography has tended to do, and I'll explain now why. But properly, the sensitivity, right, the mindset, the way, kind of a Saxon, say, could, and not only because, this, say, we talk about Saxony, but there was a broader frontier there, could understand the Gospels specifically, and equating, say, Christ and his apostles to, say, a king and his Gefolgschaft, right? So like a comitatus. And there is surely a great work, there are even some, again, it's a biblical paraphrasis, which means that it's not a translation of the Gospel in vernacular, this only was literally, a story told of the same gospel story, but told in a way, right, also in narratively speaking, that these newly Christianized peoples could understand, right? And we have looked at how, of course, Christianity was already present, was already around, what had happened in the Roman Empire and in the essentially immediate Christianization of Romano-Germanic peoples, at least, that still lived within the wake of that kind of imperial, in fact, universal cult, was pretty well known in other areas of Europe, in the north, in the center, in the east. And what we have to look at when we look at evangelization, mostly, as such, is not much the religious aspect, which is basically how they have fooled you into thinking, right? The thing, but in a political one. That is to say, obviously the two things are never separated, but the problem here is that there weren't two teams that were, struggling over, religion, right? And a clearly defined paganism, or even a clearly defined Christianity, at least as if this was the doctrinal core of the issue, right? Essentially a struggle over theology or this actual belief or that. There was no Christian Saxon that ever fought as a Christian against Charlemagne, for example. Christianity mostly spread. Saxony is, say, the example of the greatest violence carried out also in a evangelization context, at least as far as the Middle Ages are concerned. At least, we're talking about evangelization, so at least peoples that were not Christian yet, but most of Christianity, and especially in northeastern Europe, was actually spread autonomously by the same peoples that, as I explained in many videos, also had a very specific reason for doing this. And even though there was an enforcement, etc., nothing, let's say, ever took the proportion of, let's say, a Christianity, as many actual adult people believe nowadays, oddly enough, like a sort of, steamrolling, gruesome, bloody, genocidal machine that Christianized Europe with some strange and odd mechanism. And most of the reason why people think that, at least aside from further mental problems, is the fact, and sheer historical ignorance, of course, is the fact that they are convinced, again, that there was something like, I don't know, Christianity, like a border, like where there is Christianity that is just that, and everybody there believes something and does something and whatever. And from the other side, there are just pagans, that there is paganism that is a kind of an alternative way of Christianity, just another belief, and it's also something radically opposed to it, and ideologically and whatever. I think most adults actually believe that this is the case. And this is not to even say that, there was a halfway between these two views, or a middle ground, a gray area. I'm talking specifically about the fact that such things, both of them, never existed historically, right? Because there wasn't such a thing beyond the universal creed, right? And most of the differences consistently lay, first of all, in political issues. Again, the Carolingians wanted simply to secure their borders because it was anachronistic for an empire of also the size and the power of the one of Charlemagne to still keep having this harassing tribes at the frontier. So it's nothing different that happened for any other empire that rightfully have the need also to simply tell other uncivilized people to cut the hell with raids, which was especially the case here because Saxony was hardly much of a, particularly advanced place where, the Carolingians began to swim in gold after they conquered. I mean, most of the early campaigns especially were economically to the loss. I mean, the Franks knew that very well. It's just that they literally needed to curb these people, as much as it happened later with the Slavs, with the Magyars. So there is nothing actually special about the story aside from the romanticized versions of the whole thing. And the religious issue is actually much more important, at least to understand in the essentials, than the actual partitic, fantasies that, again, most adults still believe about the past, unfortunately, from a couple of 100 years, unbeknownst to their, statalistic, collectivistic indoctrination that makes them see religion in ways that has never meant to be conceived before, and also in these historical times by these very people, like as if it were something real. Now, there is here also a trap for anyone who wants to study these things, because I'm not aware, personally, I must absolutely clarify that I have a very specific, cultivation, let's put it in this way, in religion in a traditional sense. That is to say, and on a scientific base, naturally, because I can't quote you all this. Or I mean, normally when I talk about traditional religion, we made lots of videos about, normally they're titled The Rise and Fall or something. But I think there is probably an Indo-European religion playlist or history playlist. I talk mostly about that. I refer to all probably the sources explicitly of the actual myths, of the actual religions, and how the stuff was seen. And for those of you who have been following me from quite a while, have gotten interested in that topic, essentially how organic the concept really is, how also studied by names that I will not say because objectively they are controversial on an ideological point of view, but I'm also, as you know, quite critic of that, what they can't in fact at that point even properly say themselves when they're making those points, because in the moment in which they study traditional religion, they can't properly just pick, let's say, a relativistic side, whatever it is, right? So if I were properly loud vocal about who these people were, we can even make videos about those. Just know that I would, as you know already, by the way, that I am somehow, I explain why I believe differently, and it's literally a third way between whatever you can think of, at least what most people really believe to be right or left wing is, right? Because I'm definitely a more right wing leaning individual, also probably beyond what is called far, because I believe that that's mostly leftism, as a matter of fact. And in fact, most neo-paganism gets down to that, right? Neo-paganism basically is National Socialism. And I don't mean it in the Nazi sense. I mean, in theory, because it can open to that, but, you can be... I believe every nationalist and every socialist are basically the same thing. It's at some level, because the way they behave towards, again, the community and the collectivity as such is easily overlappable, and that's why you could have a national socialism. But again, nobody has ever told you this. It's not that I have to tell you that because I'm who knows whom. It's just that it's easy to think that because nobody has ever challenged you on that, right? Nobody has ever told you how this thing that existed before the 18th, the 19th century actually was like. And that's the reason why what we have now in terms of even of the sympathies towards certain ideologies is just, again, as if you have a polluted mind, an intoxicated mind that thinks something, but just not being aware that thinks that in function still of the intoxication, not of the actual traditional doctrine, which is a completely different thing, right? So these videos are somehow very difficult to always make, at least I understand, to be understood, because I also have my own way of telling things, which is rambly and it takes a while. But it's important because without this premise, you hear me talking just about these references randomly in a phrase without an introduction. I have to make it in every video, because otherwise, I don't know where are you watching this from. But also, repeating things actually is fine as far as learning is concerned. And you would just jump on another video, say, because this guy's crazy. He's talking about things that I don't even like they can't be real, right? And then maybe you will remain with that question mark. But if I don't explain that, I can't even be reliable about it. And again, the point is that even when there are authors that tend to say things like, well, but you see, paganism and Christianity were not so different after all, mostly they still tend to do it by rigidly separating them, in order at least to say, yes, they were, however, probably different things, right? Because, I don't know, the pagans believed still in human sacrifices, and they did. This is not Christian propaganda. And, I don't know, that the Christians believed in turning the other cheek. So they must have been completely irreconcilable religions. And again, this is one of the single most typical mistakes that even, I don't know, prized scholars, historians, whatever, make, right, on this base. And mostly tend also to too much strictly ethnicize the topic, in fact, in a mostly a nationalist, socialist way, so that this seems like the history of, I don't know, the German nation, as opposed to the broader part of mankind that was shaded according to certain stages of their traditional journey. Let's put it in this way, say their universal journey, interpreted in a traditional sense, and that we're coping like with different. We're talking about continental empires versus essentially regional tribes, right? So you understand how different they could be, and how difficult it is to even explain these things without an adequate comparison. So this happens again all the time. I feel even bad to be repeating it, but it's necessary, and believe me also, because this video really gets to the point, especially right with the Heliand. And other works came later, because this attitude of trying to compromise even with a certain sensitivity of the subjected was eventually crushed by the same Eastern Frankish establishment. So we're talking even properly about other, there could have been same Saxon noblemen at that point on the rest of the people. And this is, again, dramatically important also because of the so many videos on the Ottonians that we have made over time, just recently. So the idea of say the cosmic struggle and of a Christ warrior is clear, I think, to everyone. I mean, the Christianity has an especially violent language, which is properly intrinsic to the most hardcore traditional meaning. That of course, the concept also of a cosmic struggle within it, starting from the soul. So where the awareness of the dimming of the sacred was to be properly triggering you as, freaking out, because that's exactly the greatest enemy. Like, that's where properly also the Ouroboros kind of eating the roots of the cosmic tree properly is coming from, also in the Norse Germanic, what we call the Norse Germanic religion. And it goes beyond, because, by the way, all this symbolism are present. I mean, the oak, the Irminsul, whatever was present, it's present in the Bible as properly the tree. There's a cosmic, say, cornerstone, right? That the Romans had it on the Capitolium, right? So it was as universal as you can imagine. right? There was no radical identity difference. Say, oh my God, the Irminsul is such a typical local thing. No, it was literally used by every single people that I'm aware of, especially in this Euro-Mediterranean context. And it's something that goes far beyond, of course, any kind of even, way before the migration or whenever even certain identities locally, territorial were formed, whatever. In any case, the Heliand is very faithful to the gospel, right? Another specific aspect of this all is that in trying to convince the Saxons of the new kind of perspective they should have on this broader universal issue, to get to the same points that they actually believed in already, there was no need to change the essentials of Christian culture just per se, right? When we talk of Germanization, but whichever we mean, we're talking about mostly the fact that the Christian doctrine, by the way, it was professed and kind of at this point also was mirrored in the local, in the territorial administration, the ecclesiastical foundation, probably a completely different model from what had existed in Central Europe up to that point, also politically speaking, because it concentrated an unprecedented amount of power in the hands of fewer, but also to the greater effectiveness of the collectivity, as much as a meaningful power was concerned. This is again the effort of all peoples that Christianize all around, not to avoid, I don't know, the new, the Operation Barbarossa of the High Middle Ages, but concretely the fact that the elites were overwhelmingly interested in this work, because they could simply even just compact more power instead of even just banally stabbing each other at banquets on a regular basis and to engulf the entire place and the clans inhabiting in a continuous feud. It has mostly to do with a sort of bellicization, in fact, of the Christian message, right? In other words, as we were saying before, like the main change, narratively speaking, that is carried out by the Heliand in explaining the gospel is that the Savior is a perfectly orthodox figure, Christianly speaking, except he is essentially clothed with a military vest, right? He is a comitatus leader, except not quite literally. I mean, comitatus also comes from, again, we could even dissect the etymologies here, but still, any Christomimic metaphor could fit with that, but let's say the gospel is not transformed into an actual, I don't know, feud between Saxon clans, right? Still the thing is pretty fine as far as the Christian content is concerned. Just the way it's narrated makes it sound, and we'll see that here the sound was all with an experience properly in the rhythm, with the magic formulas of the Germanic world, as they were still spelled and part of the kind of comprehensive experience of the rituals, etc., could in fact become more familiar, more moving, actually, right? We know this also from later contexts of brutality that, I don't know, medieval knights again could chop people to pieces without too much problem, but as soon as, around the fire at night somebody sang of, these angelic like women that reminded them of their mothers when they were kids, that, and leaving them and their sisters, I don't know, died of childbirth, sent in some other household, whatever, they broke down in tears, right? And they had real kind of breakdowns of some sort, because the extremes were pretty brutal and pretty wild. I mean, a Saxon reality in the 8th and the 9th century, of course, was a a triply vicious one, right? As we will see now, that the entire point, the thing that probably they couldn't make the Saxons swallow was the thing of the other cheek that was removed, because this is a paraphrasis, it could still be done. But eventually they were okay with the entire concept of hierarchy, with this thing, because again, they had one themselves, right? They weren't savages, just in a strict sense. They understood, and their elites were already doing this, that there is much also to the predisposition, in fact, say, of the Germanic populations at this point in history to the idea of a lord rather than a randomly kind of contingentally elected chieftain, right? And so yes, we're talking about pretty primitive areas, but let's also not exaggerate. Germany was not already at this point the one of Tacitus, and we're not even talking necessarily, in fact, about the places that had already been colonized by the Merovingians since the Franks since the 6th century, and this is essentially the point, right? The dialectical relationship between even the author of the work and the public, right? Who was the author and who was he writing for, right? To which kind of community, socially, culturally, that was relatively homogeneous. I mean, the Saxons were pretty compact Germanic people in this case. I mean, there were surely some kind of, it's loose, whatever. For example, also with the Slavic frontier is concerned, this time is quite complicated to even ascertain. But generally speaking, in fact, because those didn't even differ from them very much. So it was just, generally speaking, there weren't so many differences for which you would have had to differentiate in turn this work particularly. So the author, as we were saying before, is a perfect Christian, right? He's concerned, as we said already, with the mentality and sensitivity of his audience. Because, above all, he considers the success of his work of the Heliand to be an essential vehicle of mission and evangelization. This is the purpose of the work. It's not compromising with the local culture per se. This is literally spreading the gospel, right? In a way that the author was also sure could be acquired, could be assimilated, could be understood, right? Otherwise, he would have not done this thing in the first place. So again, these were not, Martians that had met with, the Earthers for the first time. Again, these peoples had been knowing each other forever, right? So the Franks, especially the Austrasians, were particularly close, culturally, juridically, linguistically, to the Saxons, right? This was not the new world or some kind of radically different route, because again, mostly when we talk about the difference between Christianity and paganism, people also must stress that was any kind of, that this thing was kind of a sudden, brutal, shocking one, because there was no other reason for, the Franks to conquer the Saxons except they wanted to Christianize them. Of course, it's not the case, right? There was much over which to build, of course, a local government, as much as the universal religious understanding existed in common for these peoples to understand each other. The Saxons knew what Christianity was from a long time, right? Except they didn't practice mostly, right? And it was actually more of a problem for the Christians to not to have pagans among themselves than the pagans becoming Christian. Because again, there were Christians in Saxony before the Carolingian conquest, and again, this was not much of an issue for everyone, also because this is the point. We've seen it also in videos like about, for example, the one of the Christian martyrs, the aged martyrs mostly as Roman, say the one of military saints, especially as soldiers in the Roman army. There is nothing in all that story that has anything to do with any moral question except to whom they had to sacrifice, right? Simply those saints in the story, because mostly also were invented, but it had to be got martyrized because they wouldn't sacrifice to the Roman Emperor. That had nothing to do with shedding blood. It had nothing to do with massacring people. There was nothing about Christianity that was irreconcilable with that. As a matter of fact, it was quite easy to mix, of course, a peaceful and not a pacifist message in a universal empire that can be a universal empire only if the empire is at peace, because you can pacify that. Think about the Pax Romana in the first place. These were, we talk about the Friede in the Germanic world. It existed in the same identical way. It's a peace in arms. So these peoples, again, spoke the same identical political, cultural, universal, religious, imperial language. I made tons of videos about this, especially last year. If you go in the Migration Era playlist or in Germanic History playlist, you will find plenty of that. Because, again, I don't want to repeat myself. This is pretty basic, elementary history of religion, history of religion concept that should be known to everyone, but here we are, I guess. So the aim also of the Heliand's author is apostolic pastoral as well. This is yet another typically kind of evangelizing style. The artistic technique is a preaching one, too. Conversely, his audience is either still pagan, or at the most at least touched by the mere quick conversion that Charlemagne had imposed on the Saxons. Right. The very interesting thing is that the monk that, in fact, we think was the author of the Heliand was a Saxon himself. Right, and or at least this came to be, of course, through it's in Old Saxon, the entire work, so not only it reflects, it's not like a colonizer's kind of version of not just the Saxon language or the Saxon, let's say narrative, or kind of how we think. In fact, they would pass down this similar epos orally, right? This is pretty spot on. Philologically, linguistically, artistically, it sticks to what a Saxon would have been mostly hearing, by the way, because most of them were illiterate, as these cantilanes, part of the traditional pagan rituals and all this stuff, right? This work was written down at the Abbey of Fulda, by the way. So naturally, this was not directed just to Saxony, but mostly because at least it was the chunk of Germany that had been practically just conquered from a short time historically. So it was essentially the only land that politically had not been Christian up to a few times before. Right. A more spot on dating would be around the 30s of the 9th century. Again, we're not completely sure. In any case, this is an alliterative poem commissioned seemingly at the invitation of Louis the Pious, or according to others, Louis the German. In any case, these were Carolingians. Carolingian kings, properly Louis, also properly emperor, who had required this work to be written. This is also an astonishingly fascinating aspect of this all, right? That the Carolingians were aware of the fact. Actually, imagine the context, like the most important scholars, right? The Abbey of Fulda was, as you know, a very important Christian center and a hell of an abbey in terms of power, or whatever. So it was normal for monarchs to commission some important works of this kind, right? It's also a substantially long work. With, in this case, very specific political aims for these countries, right? And the request had specified that this work had to be written in Teodisca lingua, which in Latin is the German language, right? That is meant at this point the old Saxon vernacular, right? Because this idea of the Teutsche, Deutsche, so the Teutonic, literally, so the root word is, of course, Teute, from Proto-Indo-European, means people, right? So this is something that the Romans kind of, that's not because they called the it's just that the Teutons had been called like that as a generic term, but as you know, also there was this kind of, at least in the Roman vision of it, this progenitor of the Germans, and or at least a part of them, how they really identified that was connected to the root word and so on. And it had to do with, again, the concept of mankind, right? So again, it was a standard name that, however, by this point, through Latin literature, had been classicistically attributed, was starting being properly forged, especially in these Eastern Frankish monasteries, as the name attributable to, as you know, the Teutons had come mostly from the Jutland, right? But the sense of this northern Germans and this some kind of, pristine or kind of yet non-conquered by either Rome or the Franks, whatever peoples, that Germanic people that were somehow understood as native, and that would in fact give the name eventually in this official documents also to the kingdom, the Teutonic kingdom, as such. So it would be mostly the old Saxon vernacular, because again there weren't even German. The space of the modern country of Germany is also smaller compared to Germany as it was understood, even maybe not at the time, because part of it was in fact occupied by the Slavs, but at least in ancient times, that it was a much more territorially extended concept, and in this case, that northern corner that had not yet been brought under was perceived as somehow more Nordic, that had that connection, and it was attributed to the king, and that's how the Carolingians would see that, which is fascinating, because of course we know that Germanic was spoken at the Carolingian court, say until the 10th century, at the latest, right? But they wouldn't consider themselves as, Teutonic speakers, right? Not just because at that point, as Roman emperors, they legislated in Latin and everything, but mostly because they even just spoke another language at court, and doesn't matter how similar to Saxon, that would have been intelligible, of course, to them by a substantial degree. They didn't, as Franks, think that it had much to do with their own national identity, right? So that is important, because naturally the Saxons were a bit the enemy par excellence, right? At least in that area, and this choice for a poem on the life of Christ is indeed also a linguistic fact, right? There was a necessity from the side of the commitments to spread some ideology on the base through an intelligible language. Addressing illiterates, right, that were also more handicapped by the fact that not only they mostly didn't write, but they did not know Latin, and thus were largely kept out of the scriptural and liturgical discourse of the church at the time. And as you know, think about under Louis the Pious, already under Charlemagne, how much probably the reform of the church, also in the organization, for example, of the newly conquered lands in Saxony, for example, with the capitulary for the Saxon people, had meant in terms of political, social structures, of the foundation of churches, evangelization, also sort of control of the communities through the priests that, especially in Saxony, were pretty aware of the fact that in those early generations there was still a lot burning under the ashes against that Christian regime. So the poet of Heliand consciously opts for a work of apostolate that could really help gapping the divide, not just politically, but also spiritually. And again, it was all one with that. We have made multiple videos about the Carolingian Church, so we know how important it was for them still to consider how it is traditionally, how a common, a single heart, let's say a common spirituality, was crucial for political cohesion and the success of the empire. So it was very important for these peoples not just to have been conquered, but also to be partaking actually the support to the empire, right? In fact, in parallel to this, we will see it also in other videos about military history. The Saxons were, again, the Saxon elites were co-opted. Widukind remained, as you know, in charge by a degree. Saxon contingents were sent to various places around. Naturally, they would understand this less. They would understand less what did they have to do with the Carolingian Empire as a whole than, say, I don't know, the Burgundians or the Longobards, due to their tribal background. But they still were starting to participate. These are the same years in which already, again, that obscure Carolingian count that first settled in Saxony, it would give a line to the Ottonian dynasty, would had put his roots, right? As we will see now, the end of the period we treat today is also the one, basically, Henry the Fabler was born. We have seen it in that video on the Ottonians the other day, remembering that those people had been born in Saxony to carry out the Renovatio Imperii in the 10th century when the Carolingian Empire was still standing. Fascinatingly enough, they also get married into the Carolingians, albeit not quite getting their blood in the main line. So the author of the Heliand is all the more fascinating in the measure in which he doesn't shy away, nor he could have done so, telling the truth. I mean, given the intrinsically conservative nature of the language that he was using, the Old Saxon, as indeed of any other language by a degree, from using words that already contain, of course, traditional pre-Christian meanings, right? And that were part of the same world in which Christianity had come about, from, again, a religious tradition that was the same universal one, so that technically Christianity, it's not that it stole things because it picked it from a before that was different. No, it was the same religion. It was just, again, understood in its own way, and also at that point significantly modified also from the origins through Hellenization, through Romanization, through Germanization. Telling the truth, we have already seen it in videos about the Merovingians and how they had essentially acquired, also relatively imperfectly until, in fact, the Carolingians, speaking of the Franks, the actual meanings, but still, again, because they were immediately understood, especially in an imperial fashion, to anyone who had naturally the interest of pursuing that goal. And after all, if you look at the history of the Bible, when it was translated in Greek and in Latin, there had not been much of another chance, right? Someone, right, especially like from that we've seen there before, the negative neo-paganistic perspective, there is also a Christianistic perspective that could say, oh my God, these Saxons were a bunch of barbarians. Why did this author grant them anything? Well, what's the point, right? Christianity should be spoken, say, should be taught in all languages, should be learned in all languages. There's been a huge deal. Of course, Latin was the language of Rome that had immortalized the imperial identity, so much that the Saxons would, again, be the ones who also formally transitioned from Franks/Saxons to Romans in the actual imperial identity, formally in the documents, in everything, meaningfully enough. But again, it's obvious that if you translate the scriptures into Greek and into Latin, you will actually modify something. After all, the same Gospels are famously enough written for different audiences. Right, some are written for the Romans, some are written for the Greeks, some are for the Jews. So there is kind of, you want to stress, or it's literally what the apostles did already, just to make the effort of having the word spread in a linguistically but also culturally understandable way, with all the modifications of the case. Right, so here again, this author is not granting the Saxons actually more than it was granted to the pagan Greeks or the pagan Romans, culturally speaking. As we will see, actually, there is still a somehow substantial, orthodoxy. It's true that the pagans too didn't have, at least what we call it, this, the heathenism, whatever you want to call it, this specifically, like, there wasn't any such a thing, but the religion practiced by the Saxons, still because it was universal, less theological threat than, say, the classical mythologies, right? This is crucial to understand. It was never a time in the evangelization of the these people, so south of the empires, put in this way, in which paganism presented a theological concurrent threat, an alternative to Christianity, right? It was doomed, right? Theologically speaking, there is no match. It's the same match that did not exist between the Carolingian armies and the Saxon ones, right? And it came along with the same scale civilizational advancement of the conquerors. That's also why, by the way, this work could succeed, right? And why there was likely also a substantial cooperation, right? Not all Saxons thought that, oh my God, they were, grinding their teeth when sleeping after Charlemagne took over. There was also, after decades, a sort of, okay, well, thing goes on. The state was, ridiculously less coercive than anything we can imagine today. So again, brutal things had happened. This was an oppressive condition for many, that there had been widespread distraction. But this also had stemmed from the fact that they had tried and had lost in the end. And yes, this brings scars, but there are also elements that are fundamentally still making work what is there. And as we've seen, successfully too. Now, in Heliand, there are words that refer to the concept of word, right? That would be an equivalent of fate, Latinly speaking, charged, in fact, with the same kind of pagan sacredness, right? And corresponding to surely the Saxon mindset of the time, and a deeply rooted one, right? So the poet of the Heliand refrains either from Christianizing the word along the lines of Christian providentialism, or on the contrary from Germanizing this along the lines of the former. Right? He limits himself to adapting the Christian concept of divine will to the forma mentis, which, like the Germanic one, gave wide and sacred space to the omnipotence of destiny, and placing the two values face to face, he declares destiny in turn to be subject to the will of God. And this interpretation is seen as if, there had been a sort of overlapping or substitution or hierarchization. The point is that the concept is pretty much the same. The Wird is connected, to the Norns, to this idea. Think about the Moirai in the Hellenic mythology. These people say, sometimes, again, they match, so there must have been. Is it strange? No, and especially the fact that, we don't know an overbearing amount of stuff about ancient mythologies as much as we would like to. So it's likely that this was present among the Celts, among the Romans, among the Dacians, among the Persians, among the Sarmatians. There was surely always a deity, let's say, a spirit of an agent of some sort of faith that still was understood as still through the true traditional belief, as fundamentally something you could still shake off of you, right? The idea that fate is unescapable is a typically kind of chthonic, deterministic, superstitious belief that was irreconcilable with the idea of the Indo-European hero. I made a video about the Fortuna Kaiseris, which is basically, and hardly any people has ever heard of it, but it was basically the same concept around which Augustus built the entire representation of the Golden Age on the base of Caesar's political role, which, as some of you have also made me notice, is to be found in Beowulf, for example. It was all a thing. I mean, the idea that most people are brought under by themselves, by the fact that they're not worthy enough, they're not capable of, taking the reins of their own existence, and some can essentially exit this cage and managing to change destiny, right? So much that destiny is not just sitting there saying, "Oh, okay." It literally becomes the tool for that accomplishment to be carried out. And divine providence is nothing, also in Christian terms, is nothing but this. I mean, how much can you say? It's like the concept of free will and determinism. There is no way scientifically at this point, unless you follow materialism, strictly speaking, to demonstrate that there is either free will or a predetermined reality. The point is that it doesn't matter, right? First of all, it doesn't matter to us. But secondly, it's still, even if it could be explainable, let's say, why couldn't it be both things at the same time, right? Because this is the actual, there's been a reformation over this issue, right? So we in Europe, we consistently killed one another because of these ideas, and that's exactly, in a way, those struggles are the representation of the fall of tradition, the disgregation of universality, of properly the understanding of imperial religion and whatever. So the world ages. Today we talk about the much better 700 years before that. Well, actually, people, however, were still, and this is the point of this observation, by the way, were already actually pretty subjected to the idea of faith, right? This is what emerges from the Heliand as well, that here the Germanic hero is not quite someone who simply think about Siegfried, think about this concept of the looming threat still over even the greatest hero. It's famous, theme. Think about Hercules, think about Gilgamesh, and so on. I mean, it's the idea, how can you reach that, right? So the idea is that the Indo-Europeans were more loaded, say, than the Semites, etc., with the idea that it was possible still to reach the thing, because attaining divinity was in that sense the objective of the entire tradition. But it is true that by the 8th century, the 9th century, also in Central Europe, this concept had somehow sunk in for many reasons, mostly the fact that when we talk also about these peoples that had remained out of the tendentially beneficiary vassalitic systems that already were in place, let's say, from the late Roman world or before, and still very present in the Frankish world, that mostly we attach them to feudalism, proto-feudalism of some sort. These things were happening basically all over, right? Even when you read the Norse sagas, you understand, even the ones that have a kind of an older root or some other Germanic epics, you realize that that this is pretty much there. It's simply from the way they thought, right? You can find traces of the original thought. We've seen also for the Veda, from traditions that naturally were handed down in a period in which already the pre-Indo-European substratum had taken over again, spiritually by a degree. So here too, the idea that especially the lesser person, the subject, the guy who basically is under a chieftain, right, that acts as a sort of mobster that controls the entire clan and basically decides the thing within the clan. That's mafia basically, right? So he has already lost as this person the sense that he can be, most of the time, the hero of the situation, and can come to rule everyone and everybody, right? And generally speaking, also the political fragmentation of these peoples, we have seen it in comparison with the greater empires, had somehow made them aware of the fact that they were the little ones compared to the bigger powers that they should have feared, in as much as God, as for any earthly power, is unavoidably on their side, right? That is to say, even if that was an empire of evil that lacks sacredness and belief and whatever, if you are instead the morally, the true morally worthy one, you should be able to triumph. Doesn't matter how big the enemy is, right? This is the entire the entire point of, again, of Christian eschatology. The gates of hell shall not prevail. The same thing in the North Germanic mythology of the storming of the Asgard, and more and more and more. So it's always referred, you can argue, just as in the Christian message, it's just spiritual clash before, because it's mostly inner. Everybody believed that, right? The entire, again, any religion started from this, right? From the fact that things start from the within. And eventually you can get into a feud, you can kill people, whatever, but that's just the world. And Christianity is also pretty straightforward about that, because it's as if, it says anything that is not spiritual doesn't matter. Well, that's how much the awareness of the fact that everything that happens in the world derives from this kind of spiritual inner side should, in fact, overshadow what happens in the world, because the world is just an illusion. It's a product of the fall. It's just like in the Nibelungenlied, just like as the Germans believed that, again, the Asgard had been polluted with, in fact, because it had been built structurally with the aids of the dwarves that had touched the sacred gold, that had thus brought, like, properly a curse on the same Aether. And so that's why the heroes, at the end of the day, always fuck up, even at some point that brings to their doom. And so this is also what is going to happen to the Asgard in the first place. So again, we're talking fundamentally about the same concept. Christianity says the same identical thing. There's going to be a pretty dramatic mess. Satan has to come to rule over the earth before Christ comes again. And to fight Satan with Satan. So it's the same religion. It's the same universal creed. Everybody believes the same thing. The point is, again, how do you culturally clothe this? Right? So, it's just of how you deliver this message. It's the medium that matters here. It's not much about the content per se, right? And that's why also the style is quite important, because the use of alliterative verse with its solemn rhythm, like, in fact, the typical Germanic formulas, fascinated and moved the German. Right, it must be ascribed to the same desire to adapt to that culture. The new faith reached the heart of the former pagan through the ancient ways of his culture, through the Germanic ancestral roads to the sacred. Because it was literally believed that this rhythm corresponded to a universal harmony that you had to get in tune with, and if you did, you could evoke a power. Naturally, if you look at it in perspective, this is brutally, like, it gives you an idea of how much, of course, all these peoples had departed from the traditional reality, meaning that this was a superstition, and that's also the reason, as we will see now, while further missionaries basically said, look, this is nonsense, we have to get rid of that, because even though, again, there is the same Christian rituals are a process of this, but the idea of the cosmic harmony, which is present in the quars, in the prayers, in the contact with the Holy Ghost, the descendants of it, according to this fact uni sown heart, basically, is, again, it is definitely traditional in part. It's a cathartic process, and it's really narrow psychologically. It does have a lot to do with the traditional meaning, but it's an incredibly narrowed down concept of what a person must do in order to achieve at least salvation, right? Meaning what? Again, that a hero would have simply moved mountains with his power. Just, again, an average person in the 8th century just was praying, right? In 2023, we have people, commenting on social networks when calamities happen, people die, sending positive vibes. The little hands in prayer. That's how the world degenerates over time. So it's obvious that there wasn't here also much of a big difference if you look at the Germanic mentality and this Carolingian one, let's call it in a broader sense, really was, first of all, how close they were, but also how, in fact, the differences were political by a degree. We'll see now that mostly had to do with the degree of violence that existed just in the Saxon world, as opposed to naturally a more controlled, stable, and pacified, and more powerful Carolingian power. So if in a traditional sense, right, more power laid from the side of the empire, and if this had been achieved, it's again because that's literally what the goal of any power should be on Earth, right? There wasn't from the other side of the world a hero that was ruling in virtue of his of divine grace, with some single-handedly, with the same power of the entire Carolingian Empire. No, all humanity more or less already working in the same way, and say the greater success was from the side of civilization. That's what I want to stress, and the rest was still to go down that path. So there is no pagan residue in the poet about this. There is not a maneuver tending to smuggle the infiltration of traditional values into a new context. We're simply observing a missionary technique that takes into account an objective fact, that a concept expressed within the ambit of a certain culture in its own language is not transferred to another culture in another language, if not by adapting it, right, which means modifying it, right, at least in certain, even accidental parts, right? So this thing of, but Christianity compromised with, again, I admit it's not a very common thing to say, because this was mostly, again, people do not believe in religion anymore, so we are completely done for in the first place by any traditional standard. But at least, there was this saying these things or reading the Heliand or pointing out this aspect mostly would have hurt a Christian sensitivity by saying, that there had been a sort of Germanization of Christianity or sort of compromise with the heathen in the process. Well, it's not there, right? It's not even the fact that it shouldn't be overrated or stigmatized. It's that literally they were saying the same thing. It's just they were saying it through a different medium, That's the only thing. The content, per se, was essentially the same. And we will see now how, because there are many more conversions here. I mean, convergences and conversions too. So again, Christianity had already given the Greeks and the Romans a lot of their previous media, right? There is no doubt about that. That the entire imperial military ideology is Roman in nature. In Christianity, the language, of course, the Latin, just in Western Christendom, and again in the most successful one. So, Paul of Tarsus, we made a video about him, about the Militia Christi especially, that deals with that. That is to say, how St. Paul basically modified the evangelic message, also probably in the words, to be fitting the Roman military vocabulary and mentality and ideology, because the Romans were all about that, right? And he admitted that it was obvious that, say, a Roman pagan at the time would, before Christianization, would be looking at the cross as a madness for him, and for obvious reasons, because the cross was just the most infamous of the scaffolds, right? So we explained the meaning of that too. It was such a kind of thought-provoking idea that essentially even the greatest power of the greatest earthly power can not achieve what, in theory, a perfectly pure soul can, even by winning, raising from the dead, and conquering the world, by the way, including the Roman Empire that became Christian, in case you didn't notice, by this merely spiritual inner issue, right? So in a moment in history in which, according to Christianity, God had basically assessed that there was no other mean to stimulate essentially a spiritual response but through sacrificing his own son. And as if you know Norse mythology, you know that Odin, actually, in order to accomplish the knowledge of the runes, and so acquiring this crucial wisdom that could easily equate with the Logos, as a matter of fact, hangs himself. He sacrifices himself. Again, this is present in so many other different religions that as we know, comparatively are all the same one. They all, again, ad nauseam, believed the same identical thing. Everywhere. Right? It had been difficult to have that word accepting the cross merely, or having it become an object of adoration. It mostly sparked a sensation of horror, of disgrace. Only very morally inferior criminals were crucified because they were considered so disgusting that was the only thing that could happen to them, right? Then after the world changed further, Constantine also made the cross a military insignia and triumphal symbol, of course over death, the same imperial ideology. So imposing it on the adoration of people accustomed to adoring military insignia and triumphal symbols, as the cross did become. The Carolingian horsemen brought the cross, right, while conquering Saxon. And they won, by the way. So over whichever symbology the locals would have opposed to them. So when one is willing to accept all this, then there is no reason to be indignant before the poet of Heliand, who, using poetic words and rhythms of ancient pagan sacredness, again, did much less concessions to Germanic paganism than the Roman Christian emperors had done to Roman military paganism, right? that was, again, the same one of the Germans. Again, it was the same identical religion. So, of course, all the commitment and effort, for example, we talk about him, also we talk about the Frisians and other people that was forcibly converted by the early Carolingians, of a Saint Boniface, so that Christian truths were exposed to and then by German converts, according to the source, in ipsa lingua qua nati sunt, so in the same language in which they have been born, and the baptized pronounced the formulas of abrenuntiatio and confessio in their mother tongue. As the source says, ut intelligant quibus abrenuntiant vel quae confitentur. That is to say, so that they have to pronounce the formulas of rejection of the devil and confession in their own language, so that they would understand what they were renouncing and what were they essentially believing in. So this was therefore itself a reevaluation also of the Germanic vernacular, right, and of the Germanic mentality through the same. In other words, again, any people must Christianize. The word is for the world entire, so the Saxons were meant to understand it in the same way. There would have not been any reason why they could have not. Now, if scriptural passages and liturgical formulas were adapted to the vernacular, then with much deeper reason, certain concepts had to be more properly adapted to the mentality of those who spoke such vernacular. Because, again, it was not just about language. It was about the characters, the roles, the values, at least in a human dimension. So, in a divine one, more or less understood each other. Then the point was, humanly speaking, what are the standards here, right? We have seen how in different countries, like, judicial duel was, gradually ruled out because objectively it doesn't serve much of a purpose in a civilized reality. In an orderly one, in a politically compact one, if you need people to start dueling in the street over, whatever they want to do, it's not really going to be a great war. So it's pretty bizarre to me, again, to see in this degeneration from tradition. Like, there are people, let's go back to that, right? As if, having a civilization was not an accomplishment, right? Instead of having already collapsed entirely, right? There is something good in this. Let's keep it going. Let's keep it alive. Let's prevent it from falling apart, which is exactly what you're trying to do, because you do not see the scale of the extent of the Holy Ghost power in the hands of civilization, in the capacity of making two morons cutting off with any bullshit and going back to work instead of, killing each other, right? Because that's where it really gets down to. So when you read the Heliand, there are so many things there that you should be able to properly to hear it as well, because it was, like most works at that time, again, spoken in some kind of rhythm, as we just said. So in the Heliand, you can easily see what, in fact, these noble Saxons, because this was mostly directed also not just to the average person. Let's be honest about this, because the average person already didn't count particularly in the Saxon world, just per se, right? The noble Saxons assembled, as in olden times, with not much difference in the first place, in the banquet halls to listen to the song of a bard. Well, they would hear in the Heliand the things like the sweet truths of the Sermon on the Mount, and certainly it would have been marveled at them, right? Like saying, this concept stresses mostly essentially a peaceful view of the world, or something that must be attained as such, right? How is it possible to attain that, right? It's a challenge just per se. And it says, but so the point could not be beyond a certain confident sign that the ethic of mercy would have been accepted by the warrior earth, right? So, for example, the passage according to which whoever struck the right cheek must be offered the left was suppressed, right? And this is meaningful because it would have. It's not that the Saxons would have been fundamentally they would have simply mocked it, right? It would have been ridiculous. There were some places of older Christianization in the Carolingian Empire. This concept too was seen as just, yeah, again, it's an ideal, but again, traditional duel was still there. So obviously the Christian world still worked in a different way. So obviously not everything that Jesus says or does is what you're expected to do, but not necessarily what, humanly speaking, could be attained, considering the divine standards entailed in the first place. But this shouldn't also be an excuse either, or just to not take in consideration. But again, the Heliand is a paraphrasis of the Gospel, so there were some things that were just omitted, right? Not particularly, again, there is nothing particularly wrong, again, in orthodox terms about this. There was not the risk of a new heresy stemming from it. No, it's basically the same thing, with just minor narrative differences, such as this one. But it's obvious that the Germanic ethic of vengeance was somehow more radically opposed to the idea that, given that you had suffered an offense, you couldn't wash that in blood in practice, because this betrayed already the tribal and clanic background of the locals. Because according to, I made a video about Germanic law, and we have seen how the situation in these countries was so fragmented and unstable, politically speaking, that the only way, say, the most stable unit was the clan, right? So clans, as we were saying before, also worked as such, meaning that people within them had already lost a substantial amount of autonomy. Just like in the warband, that is different, but conceptually, from a hierarchical point of view, finds the same thing. I mean, there is a leader there. You can't simply be the last of the youth that decides to do something unless you actually succeed and get away with that. By some degree, you're admired. Whatever, these people admire courage, being bold and all this stuff, but there is already an incredibly and traumatically and viciously brutal order imposed within and on the freeman that feels protected, as it could eventually in the following century feel protected by a even more powerful landlord, because de facto there are some guys within the clan that own more power than the others, right? And that are incidentally, again, the same ones we're talking about here that basically were co-opted by the Carolingians as the future nobility that married into the Frankish counts that started these dynasties, including the ones who would rule Saxon later on in a fully Christian context, right? So the interesting aspect of this is that the logic behind the feud was the making justice in the quickest way possible, because especially these feuds could occur between clans, but also within the clan, right? Between people of the clan. And the idea, in the first place, was that, especially within the clan, if there was a fracture, so the two people were once against the other and it was not a univocal direction of the entire group, the group would become weaker. So you had to immediately make justice, right? In other ways, and you understand that it was a pretty brutal justice, right? I kill you, your family kills me, right? or an equivalent, because every person has a price. So if you killed a random guy, you could also pay in pigs the family, and the family would be content with that. I mean, that's also the general sensitivity to human life before somebody whines about the massacre of Saxons during the Carolingian times. It's the same reason why, again, they mostly didn't have many better options than going raiding into somebody else's countries, or their own, by the way. But the idea was quickly compacting power, right? So recompacting political cohesion. Here, think about it in this perspective. You have a power that has conquered you in arms, and you have basically succumbed. And this power is talking to you about peace. Now, that's the voice of a civilization. That's the voice of there is an order that must be maintained at a level that you can't even fathom, that you could have not before you were actually conquered by us. Right? So be aware of the fact that this peace and this kingdom of heaven can be achieved mostly through what we do as an empire than what you do as a tribe, practically. Right? And we do not hear much of the Saxon voice, but again, think about the cultural shock of what had happened in the previous generation. Right? We don't know, unfortunately, anything because these peoples didn't even write, practically. And the question, of course, remains, who knows what was the general thing. Probably was a much more immediate one than we think. But again, this people was successfully integrated within the empire, so, and even to an important profit for their own later in a few generations. So the question is, you understand that these people were already ready for Christianization by a degree, to the degree of success that happened historically. So there was an understanding on this basis. We want to depict the Saxons as, oh my god, these were just a bunch of primitive brutes that believe about, I don't know, trees and other stuff. But again, these were the same things that actually were believed from the other side as well, and that of which the same Saxons were already aware. We are the primitive brutes who do not know shit about history. And that's also in many ways the price again of continuous degeneration that happens both during civilization and during non-civilization, but mostly during the latter, in case you didn't notice. Holding things together is a sign of divine power. The taking away at least the idea that you should just be slapped by someone was obviously intelligent, in as much it would have risen scandal and caused repulsion even just per se, because not even a Frank would have basically accepted that as an affront, right? It's interesting how, after all, delicate that this thought is from the author of the Heliand, because after all, to us, with all the things that we could imagine may have not been understood by the Saxons in a broader sense, because yes, they understood this whole concept of what we're talking about, that they were just probably also trying to understand this new way was being told. That's why they created, in fact, a poem in Old Saxon. In fact, so in a broader political sense, in a social sense, the church administration, what this new practice really was, as if you had, in fact, to understand a new language. But of course, there were some passages, certain concepts that, are theologically complex to the point that not even, in fact, an 8th century Frank would have fully understood. Right? Also the degree of control that the Franks, the Carolingians, exercised on this conquered, previously pagan, newly converted population was satisfied with essentially preventing insurgency. Like, this was the point. They really really didn't care if, let's say, the average Aquitanian peasant had in his local country festival some kind of strange pagan pseudo kind of, it would mostly be a hybrid between Christianity and, again, because it were the same thing by a degree, but something that was evidently somehow more paganistically superstitious, because nobody cared about an Aquitanian peasant. It wasn't Aquitanian peasants that made the thing, if not on a large mass, let's say, that was still under a Carolingian nobility. So in many ways, what really the Franks were trying to curb here was also the most developed element of Saxon politics and society, so that the noblemen fundamentally into thinking, look, this happened. They would understand it more, by the way, because they understood the subtleties of power more, and so also indirectly the implications of the Bible more than the average Saxon freeman, right? This is important to stress as well. And where teachings of peace and forgiveness could be presented in a way less offensive to the ethics of the listeners, the Heliand does so. If you look at this work, you realize, for how it was structured, etc., that it had taken a consistent amount of time, caution, patience, right? There was something that was arbitrarily distorted, perhaps, right? At least if you read it in a fully Christian sense, it may have not been particularly reassuring, because you could see at least that the language was slightly different, that this did sound like a more kind of earthly story than how the gospel is conceived in the first place. But what was at stake was more important than this, after all, just narrative alteration. Right? What was better? To just leave the Saxons unaware, right, of Christianity, like not helping the efforts of Christianization, just treating them like children, basically saying, you don't understand this, you're just a bunch of brutes, right? Again, the entire evangelic message is based on the opposite concept. And there was definitely a lot of work in this direction, aside from the harsh Carolingian secular law of forced conversion, right? So when one complains about the superficial and warlike Christianity of the Middle Ages, first of all, one has to report to the times being, right? Including the fact that not just religion in its universality is a malleable concept, that the most important ones are not fashion or details, but the doctrinal body, right? So something that, of course, must be refined and be studied. That this was not just the clerks, just the clergy would fundamentally take care of this, right? And gradually spread, because these were all children from also the local nobility. So there was the thing spread anyway as an understanding, and etc. But we have also to think of also what was the political objective of this, right? So not much just the compromise of a negotiation, but what was the alternative to such adaptation? So in order to replace the message of general peace that again could be found in a sense of order established by the comitatus, right, with the concord, and on the other hand with the ethics of force and revenge that still was entailed by deterrence, that is however understood as a more of a secular thing that does not happen in the gospel, that is uniquely about, again, the spiritual dimension, but there is something about that too, including, I don't know, Jesus getting angry at the temple and making a mess against the merchants. Like, that tells you also the degree by which Christianity is not meant just as, I have all just to be peaceful, right? We'll see now. There are also bloody passages of the gospel, not just in Christ's passion. But one could only act step by step in this passage, by initially leveraging from an operation that would have resulted in an authentic overthrow of values, those elements that in such an ethic were less distant from the Christian world, or could in any case be adapted to it. And so again, the concept of the comitatus. So honor, fidelity, group solidarity, all things that matched with the sense, again, of a essentially a virile heroism and virtuosism. Jesus with the apostles is just like a Comus with his retinue, right? So that the savior of, in fact, Heliand, the savior, becomes the sure leader, right? The prince bestower of gifts, interestingly enough, right? So the concept of redistribution of it, again, it's a communitary value that was seen, of course, as everything that comes from, earthly speaking, is derived from, in positive terms, is God-given, and the leader is the medium of this, right? As in the Roman emperors, as in the Germanic chieftains, as in the, in fact, in Christ and Christianity. So he's the guide that does not betray. He's the truth, right? He's the one that, at least in relative terms, on earth, embodies the safest option, the safest, the point of reference, the best individual, the one that comes closer to God because of his inherent virtue. And naturally, the disciples are his Gefolgschaft. The Sermon on the Mount, even with its non-martial content, is a speech by a leader to his people gathered in the Germanic Thing. Right? In the description of the wedding in Canaan, we can distinctly breathe the atmosphere of sacred, solemn drinks in the banquet halls of the Germanic leaders' houses. Peter, who draws his sword and wounds Malchus and spills blood, and this excited the Saxons particularly, is a faithful and valiant Comus of Christ that defends his leader when attacked, right? And most of all, the impassive Christ on the cross recalls Odin hanging from the Yggdrasil. Remember this. The same concept of self-sacrifice to achieve a higher knowledge and transfiguration. It's all there. It's always been there, and it had been like this for millennia everywhere, in all these beliefs. Of course, in all this, when we read the Heliand, we have to realize that this is just a work made by one guy, or multiple guys, but it's not the only one possible that you can just accept or get away with, or it's the product of that specific first half of the 9th century Eastern Frankish kingdom, as also a royal commission for trying to win over this more reluctant Saxons, right, to cooperate with the Carolingian government. So about 40 years later to this, we're again in the 70s of the 9th century now. The monk Ottfrid who came out of the school of Rabanus Maurus, composed the Evangelienbuch in the Franconian southern Rhenish dialect in the Weissenburg Abbey in Bavaria. This one was dedicated, among the others, to Louis the German as well. Again, we don't know whether the Heliand was commissioned already at the time of Louis the German or Louis the Pious. In any case, what is important now politically is that the Evangelienbuch of Ottfried comes after the Stellinger revolt. At this point, basically the Eastern Frankish nobility has successfully brought under the rest of the people that have tried to rebel. They sided even with the slaves, just to understand also how close the concept that you could also make an alliance for life with somebody that should be hanging from a scaffold, right? Just like Christ, according to that sense of, apparent passivity against his killers, right? And the attitude of this monk Ottfried is quite different. You can understand it by the different political climate, the fact that it's not written in the most, at least, Germanic popular language, but in the Franconian southern Rhenish dialect, which is essentially the place where, at least where it was spoken, was the single most Frankish area of Germany, the one that had been already colonized successfully by the Franks since Merovingian times, and that represented a bit like probably the Frankish legacy in the country to the greatest, right? Where also probably imperial authority was connected, and etc. Ottfried composed the Evangelion book, so the book of the Gospels, with a specific intention. It was to react to what he called the obscene chant of the laity, to the, how he puts it, rerum sonus uitelum. That is to say, we don't want any of these songs basically to circulate anymore. We don't like the fact that even this stuff is written in vernacular in the first place, that people basically in the Eastern Frankish kingdom can see this as, sort of continuity with their kind of idea of the world that they had before regarding to politics, regarding to society, because that's the thing that they care about the most, right? Not the theological issues, but the fact that we had to essentially make them believe that we were just making them continue to believe in the same thing. They took it as just as a compromise from us. This shouldn't be the case, because at this point especially it's over. There is not that risk politically anymore. This country's changing, that is reverting to the older system at all. There has been a revolt, was being brutally repressed, that again was more social in character than in political in terms of rebellion or whatever. But by this point the establishment has affirmed itself in a way that can use much more direct means here. And Ottfried began by, first of all, for example, rejecting the alliterated verse that, as we've seen, had been dear to the national epos of the Saxons, to replace it with that coupled iambic dimeter characteristic of Latin Christian hymnographers, as it had been, because naturally Christianity had at that point a very advanced kind of hymnic tradition. So with the Evangelion book, we are faced with kind of an integralist path in the missionary technique, right? Ottfried accepts the vernacular, right, as such, right? He doesn't say we should ban it at all. because especially the epic should be the same ground in which Christianity has to crash this culture, right? And at least as far as any ambition in a kind of more, nostalgic, revanchistic direction can be. But he places himself with respect to it, in fact, in a competitive rather than a dialectical relationship. He, exposes poetically the Gospels, conceding nothing, if not just the use of the same language of the pristine traditions of his people. This is important because, again, vernacular, especially in north of the Alps, was becoming a literary language for the same fact that Latin was so distant from, especially this more Germanic areas, that there was no real interest in kind of trying to push it. If you could speak in vernacular, it was better. Right? Important was being understood, right? But the Otfrid's work is still an alternative to the conciliatory method proposed by the author of Heliand. Again, different times, different generations. Lots of water passed under the bridges, and a lot of blood too, by the way. So at this point, what we see as the world of the vassalic beneficiary system, also the one that Germany would become in the following centuries, is quite clear. Otfrid wasn't speaking to the German's heart, let's say, in the ancient language of the magic formula, but rather he intended to almost bend this, right? To bend properly the taste and the ear of the subjects to the discipline of the cloister and the choir. So one interesting consideration of here in conclusion is that paradoxically these lands became more privatistically subjected to the nobility than any other area of the Carolingian Empire. Right? This is and it's post times, meaning that, and this speaks also of that kind of part of the reasons why probably also these peoples had not been able to withstand naturally Carolingian onslaught in the first place. Were not cohesive enough. That is, there was already within their society a divide that the Carolingians just contributed to widen forever, basically. So that there weren't systems like the clan, the tribe, that could that had a future in that world anymore. They were simply crushed because the same local people organized themselves differently, and those who were at the bottom didn't have the force to make it happen in a different way. It's true that the Eastern Frankish kingdom maintained kind of took more to establish an elite, a surplus. I mean, probably an establishment of the same, level of wealth and power than, say, the Western Frankish kingdom. But at the same time, the divide locally that existed between the common people and the noblemen was, in relative terms, just too big for the latter to have like a liberty, as we understand it, practically anymore. Again, this is really important. I made a video about Conrad, let's say the Eastern Frankish kingdom at the time of Conrad II, and we've seen how by essentially we're talking about not even 200 years later, just a bit more than 100 years, and also a time in which, again, Germany eventually developed a functional monarchy in its own, re-established the empire, etc. The majority of people living there were somebody else's people, right? They were living under, they belonged to someone else, which is different from other areas, not the majority of them, but say that sense that I don't know, there was just a successful system that could have traditionally sustained whatever and recovered and maintaining again the autonomies of this failed. And it failed simply because again tribes and clans cannot sustain more let's say are incompatible per se with a royal government, an imperial government that doesn't literally know what to do with these, right? It transforms them into sort of kind of military retinues with an ever more stratified society where few people can rule over many other people. And even though some areas of Germany naturally took more time to be properly feudalized and properly, it would take another couple of centuries, by the way. Say the least stratified ones were also the most unstable, the most troubled ones, the frontier ones, where wars were more frequent, right? And the others were instead more pacified, were also the more developed, the ones that would create more civilizational and cultural output. Again, so I need to stress this because it feels as if every time you tell this story, you were doing something wrong to someone by saying that civilization stems also from the sacrifice, right? And that's the same concept of Odin and Christ, right? If you don't understand this concept, which doesn't mean we just simply throw people under the bus to get better, right? But actually the fact that the majority of people simply evolve in that system by giving power to those who were at the top without picking arms, and understanding that this was a more sensible way to actually step further in the path of of actually better life in a consistent sense. Again, the fact of losing liberty up to a certain point is absolutely compatible with an improvement of general life quality, right? Because I don't know what you prefer, to be alive or to be maybe with less liberty, or to be freer but with dead, right? Or with a much higher chance of being dead. Well, this is the reason why initially you couldn't tell the Saxons not to accept the concept of turning the other cheek, because they would have seen from their perspective just what they were habituated to at that stage of civilization. If you don't respond, somebody's going to step on you. But when you step actually further up, you realize that if you don't do that, you can't have the stability to even just become ever more powerful in the world. And again, I stress it, especially the fact that the Saxons collected the imperial legacy and reactivated essentially what we call the Holy Roman Empire, I think tells a lot about this all. Right, so you have to reconcile. This is the problem of people today, that they don't understand anymore that imperial tradition and the superiority of a people consists in the abortion of nationalism and socialism, that are just wanting to be a backward people that cannot even think of itself outside of a piece of dirt that somebody has drawn a line around, instead of conquering the entire universe. Right? And this is the greatest weakness and properly personal, human, and moral inferiority of the majority of the world nowadays. And I'm really talking about the majority of the world, the majority of most of what, at least our culture calls respectable people. Supposedly respectable. Nobody knows why. We have also learned, of course, from this that we should give a degree of trust, of autonomy, of possibility of liberty proper, not freedom, right, to people, in order for them to still be able to make it and contribute to the system, right? But we cannot remain blind in front of the fact that this system is collapsing once again. And the reason why it's collapsing is because we've given too much without requiring, so too much rights without duties, fundamentally. And in these times, everybody understood how deeply important that was, and that's why you could understand the concept of self-sacrifice of Christ Odin, or the devotion of an apostle or a follower of a warband, because that was the common language they spoke, and they would have preferred to die rather than coming less to that. So at that point, it's the intelligence of the elite that finds a meeting point that says we can bring this further, and at that point you have to be able to accept it. If you are not able to provide with a different option, right, that works and that succeeds. And all of Europe got Christianized, and without needing to invade other lands, right, in the process, from Christian areas to the non-Christian ones. Not all of them. This is true for, look at the Baltic Crusades, whatever, but mostly the majority of Central, Northern, and Eastern Europe were converted like this. And if blood ran, it was, again, between elite parties supported by their people that were essentially the most powerful one trying to Christianize and centralize, the other one opposing them just because, and as soon as they came to power in their place, Christianizing and centralizing. That's literally how it happened. And the people were fine with that because they supported either ways, either parties. And without that, you cannot have a government in the first place. Like, if you don't have the support, the decisive moral support of the people, which means not the majority of the people, but the majority of the people will mean anything, because the others can complain, just like you see around all social media nowadays, people complaining about the terrible world rulers that are, trying to steal them of who knows which liberty, but they don't do anything. They stay behind social media, commenting passively and just becoming fatter and lazier and more stupid and less educated the more time passes. Right, so that's what happens to people who are not able to maintain the imperial tradition, in case you didn't notice. And this was definitely the simplest, most productive, most logical line to take. Right. If there had not been, if the path had been simply fully understood through the Heliand, say better, there would have not been the need of creating an Evangelion book. That's the actual thing, right? Once things take a turn, you have to understand which one it is, and this requires intelligence, right? So when this is not found, when there is just senseless confrontation over something that eventually you're going to lose, this you must understand on the basis of how much you're willing to put in it. And generally speaking, that's how it ends, right? And so I just leave on this note. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.